Okay, just a little bit about how the ranking points are calculated. I think this is something that we need to understand a little better about how CART calculates the points, because I know it affects a lot of things that we do. So, and basically, I think some of the problems that we had last year with the ranking points was, first thing is there was some unexpected results. A lot of the offices um, had expected some applications to rank high and they didn't, and some that were expected to rank low may have ranked higher, and they couldn't quite figure out what the what the problem was. So hopefully by looking at this, it'll kind of show how some of those results come out. And also we had some problems with ranking not consistent, either rankings not being consistent in the individual county, or rankings not being consistent, especially across county lines, because some of the way things were done. And I hope that I can kind of show kind of how some of that happened. So we'll look at individual problems, and hopefully when you see how some of those points are calculated, you'll understand why it wasn't consistent and why we have some unexpected results. Just a few things to go through before we start is basically the ranking is made up of several components. Um, the first one is the vulnerability component. And this is basically how vulnerable a particular land unit is to having resource concerns that don't meet the planning criteria, or in CART's case, that don't meet the threshold. Um, so basically, the higher vulnerability, the more points they get. Also, there's a plan practice effects components, and each practice is assigned points for resource concerns that it would positively affect. So a particular practice is assigned points for, say, for instance, sheet and rill erosion, wind erosion, organic matter depletion, etc. Then we have the part that we've used in the past, kind of in the AERT, is basically the resource priorities and the program priorities. These are a set of questions that the most of the time the local work group or the program staff sets up the questions to give the applicant points for addressing resources or addressing program priorities. And then we then we have the efficiencies. So those five components make up the total ranking score. And if you look at, let's look a little bit at the formulas, how those are calculated. It'll kind of help you to understand how those come about. So if we look at, first off, the vulnerability, and we see we have a ranking component weight percentage, a resource concern category percentage, and a resource concern percentage. Each of the resource concerns are divided into separate categories. For example, wind and water erosion is a category, and the concerns in that category is sheet and rill erosion and wind erosion. So each those categories can have different percentages, and the resource concerns can have different percentages. And basically, the ranking component weight is multiplied times the sum of this information. For vulnerability, it is defined as the threshold minus the existing condition or existing practice. Then that is actually multiplied by the planned land unit acres divided by the total acres. So if they're only doing something, or if there's only a vulnerability on one of several fields, it may be lower than if that vulnerability existed on all the fields. So the acres of the land unit divided by the total acres is very important in giving them points. Then, of course, that the threshold times the minus the existing condition plus the existing practice times the percentage of the field in the assessment is multiplied times the resource concern percentage, and then multiplied times the resource concern category percentage. Then all of those for each field are summed up and multiplied by the ranking component weight to give you the vulnerability. The next one is the practice effects, and it's similar. It is the planned practice points multiplied by the percentage of the field acres of the total, and then multiplied by the resource concern percentage. All those are summed for each field that has a practice on them, and then they are multiplied by the ranking component weight. So it gives you the ranking or the practice effect score. Then we have the resource priorities, and these are a set of questions and varying depending on how many questions there are. But basically, each question has each answer to the question has points assigned to it. So those points are all totaled up and then summed and multiplied times the ranking component weight to give us the resource priorities. Then we have the program priorities. It's similar to the resource priorities. There are questions, there's answers to those questions, and each answer gives a certain number of points. Those are added up and multiplied times the ranking component weight. The last one is the efficiency, and it's basically, I'm not exactly sure how it's all calculated, but it's the points allocated to the answers. I'm not sure which answers that is. I think it's probably either the resource component and then multiplied times the average cost of the practices so that it gives us a efficiency score. And usually those are pretty small and not really, it doesn't really affect things very much, but it basically just means that, you know, if you've got a practice that is very efficient cost-wise in addressing resource concerns, then it actually gets more points than one that costs more money and doesn't address the concern as well. So that's the efficiency score. So I'm going to switch over to the spreadsheet that I developed. And again, this is a little bit, there's a lot of information here. I mainly kind of put some slides together so that you could kind of see everything as we go through this. But this is, and you know, when you look at those formulas, you're like, okay, well, how does that affect things? It's kind of hard to see that in a formula. And I'm better at actually looking at numbers. I wanted to see how those numbers stack up. So basically, you know, this kind of gives us an idea of how those numbers stack up. Before I go any further, I just want to make sure everybody can see the spreadsheet. So somebody let me know that you can see the ranking points calculation spreadsheet.
Yes.
Okay. So we will start with the simple, the resource priorities and the program priorities. Those are pretty simple. Basically, generally, you know, it may add up to 200, 250. I'm not sure what the maximum amount of points is, but let's just say for the program priority, they went through the ranking and came up with a number of points. Before I go any further, I just want to show you that this part over here is the assessment. This is basically what happens in the assessment part of CART, and this is what happens in the ranking part of CART. And if you look at all the different percentages, the resource concern percentages are set here under these resource concern categories. So if you see this 10%, it's set in the ranking pool here as 10%, water and wind erosion. 10%, the category is 10%. And this ranking, the resource concern percentage, is based on each one of these categories may have multiple resource concerns in those. Wind and water erosion only has 2, and they are set here in this instance of 50% each. So basically, sheet and rill erosion is 50%, wind erosion is 50%. So the sheet and rill erosion here is 50%. And this example, this is a very simple analysis. This is one resource concern. It's just sheet and rill erosion. So in this case, the only thing that is assessed is sheet and rill erosion. There are no other resource concerns that have been identified for assessment, only sheet and rill erosion. Then we go here to the percentages of the different components. The vulnerability percent is shown here is 20%. It's here in this when you set up the ranking pool. The plan percentage, plan practice effects is 15%. The resource priorities is 50%. The program priorities is 5%. And the efficiency is 10%. And notice the efficiency where the templates that are set up for these have allowable minimums and allowable maximums. And the efficiencies, the minimum is 10, the maximum is 10, so the only thing you can choose is 10. These other ones, you could adjust those based on what your priorities are. In other words, this program priorities is only at 5%, but it could have been 5 to 15%. So you can adjust those. And again, all these have to add up to 100%. So just a little bit of information about that. And let's just say, for example, on the resource priority, we summed all the points that he came up with. And let's say he had 200 points. So that gives us 100 points because the resource priority is 50% of the 200 points. And then our program priority, let's say, for instance, he also scored 200 points on that. Well, when we do that, he only gets 10% of those because our program priority percentage is set low at 5%. So in this case, and I'm going to just put in a 5 for the efficiency. So basically, without having any resource concerns or doing any practices, he has 110 points based on the program priority, the resource priority, and the efficiency. So that's kind of at the end. I'm kind of going about this backwards because generally you would do this assessment first and then it will bring it forward into here. Okay, so we look at that. We see that, hey, we've got 110 points. Now we're in CART and we're going to develop, we answer the questions and it's going to come up with the threshold, the existing conditions, and then we'll put some practices in. So let's say, for instance, in this case, in field 1, which is only 20 acres out of the 100, his existing condition is 30, which means there is a vulnerability. But that 30 points is divided by the acreage of the field. And since the field is only 20%, it totals up to 4 points. Well, then that 4 points is multiplied times the resource concern percentage times the resource concern category percentage times the resource concern percentage times the vulnerability. And for those 20 points, he gets 0.04 points. So that's kind of how it works. And notice that it's based on the vulnerability of the total. So in this case, only one field was vulnerable and it was a low percentage, so the points are low. So you can see that we're not having a very high vulnerability score. And then you can also, let's say, for instance, the other field we determined that it also had a 30 existing condition. Well, when we do that, we get the full 20 points, but it's still multiplied by all these percentages. So it comes out with 0.2. So in this case, if this field was not vulnerable, we have 110.54, whereas if it was vulnerable, we have increased our score to 110.7. So seems kind of minor, but that is kind of how the vulnerability works. The next thing that we would look at is the plan practices. Let's say, for instance, sheet and rill erosion is a problem here, and the planner decided, well, we're going to do a cover crop. The points assigned to each practice is set in the practice point spreadsheet, and it's put into CART where that points for certain resource concerns for addressing or putting those practices in. For example, sheet and rill erosion, if we're doing a cover crop, we get 20 points. So our plan practice for field 1 is 20 points. So we put a cover crop in field 1 and that increases our points slightly. But notice we only get 4 of those 20 points because this is only 20% of the total land in the assessment. So in that case, we only get a small portion of what he's doing. So this rewards, or the more practice you put in, the more areas you cover, well, then you get more points for. For example, if we decide, well, we're also going to do the cover crop in field 2, When we do that, then that increases our points again. So our points are increased again based on those practices that we have there. So the vulnerability gives you some points, and the more vulnerable you are with the fields, the more points you get. The practices give you points, and the more practices you put in, the more points you get for that. So I will pause it just for a second and see if anybody has any questions at this point. All right. Well, in that case, we will move to a little bit more complicated. So we've got this simple assessment where we're assessing one resource concern. But let's say, for instance, the planner also decided to assess wind erosion. So we have here that you notice that the sheet and rill erosion, we have 112.2. If we're assessing wind erosion, we also have 112.2 if there is no vulnerability. So this is not vulnerable to wind erosion. There's not a problem there. But you have to keep in mind that this cover crop that we're doing in fields 1 and 2 also gives us points for wind erosion. So even though there's not a vulnerability, he gets 20 points for those 2 fields. So in that case, our sheet and rill erosion is 112.2, and just because we also assessed wind erosion and we put this cover crop practice in and he gets points for that cover crop, it's 113.7. So you can see where the number of resource concerns that are assessed makes a difference, because points are assigned to those based on the resource concerns, and planners may not even think about, well, and notice that they got 20 points for that cover crop, even though there wasn't a wind erosion problem out there. Now for EQIP, that sounds, wait a minute, we're giving them points for something when they're not addressing a problem. Well, that's true. But keep in mind that this tool is designed to be program neutral. So in this case, for CSP, it would make sense to give him points for doing a practice when there's not a concern out there. So you can see that those increased points come about because he gets points for those resource concerns that are being assessed, whether or not there is a problem. Now, of course, if there was a wind erosion problem here, then he would get more vulnerability points, but the practice points are not going to change. So we see that, those kind of make a big difference there. And also, let's go a little further. Let's say, for instance, we also assess concentrated erosion. And again, maybe there's not any ephemeral gullies or bank erosion or classic gullies out there. However, the cover crop is going to give him 15 points for ephemeral gully erosion. So 15 points there and 15 points there because he's doing the cover crop in both fields. And now we're up to 114.26. So again, sheet and rill erosion only, 112.2. Wind erosion, 113.7. Concentrate erosion, 114.26. So if you continue to add more resource concerns that are being assessed, for example, the soil quality limitations, the aggregate stability, he gets 20 points for that cover crop practice. For compaction, he gets 25 points. For organic matter depletion, he gets 15 points. And for soil organism, I think it was 20. I don't know why that one's not showing up there. He also gets 20 points for that. So now he's doing one practice on both fields. We assessed only sheet and rill erosion. We come up with 112 points. We add wind erosion, we're up to 113. We add concentrate erosion, we're up to 114, and we're adding soil quality, and now we're up to 117 points. The only difference is the resource concerns that we assessed. So it's very critical that those be consistent from one field office to the other. In most cases, some offices, well, they say, well, I'm only going to do a couple because those are the ones he's wanting to address. And then maybe they do that for everything, but all of a sudden there's one of those applications that also has a CSP, which means they have to assess more resource concerns. And when they do that, it increases the score of that one where they assessed more resource concerns. So it's very important that they consistently assess a set of resource concerns across ranking pools, across programs, or even for conservation planning. So that's hopefully that gives you a little bit of idea about why we see so many differences in the consistency across those. A lot of times it's based on the number of resource concerns they've assessed. So one of the things that we discussed as a team, the planning team, was coming up with a list of required resource concerns that are assessed for all, say for instance, non-irrigated cropland, regardless of whether they're signing up for EQIP or CSP, or they're not signing up for anything at all. They're just doing a conservation plan. So basically, that would mean that every cropland non-irrigated at a minimum would assess this list of resource concerns. And we've come up with that for the different land uses so that everybody would be consistent on how those are assessed. And hopefully doing that will actually make our ranking more consistent. So hopefully these are some of the things that I thought of as steps to improve this consistency. For one is, they need to understand those ranking percentages, how they set those components. When you look at when you look at the vulnerability, the plan practice percentages, and et cetera, you can change those things. For example, in this case, if we had changed the sheet and rill erosion components and the wind erosion components to 100 and 0, then he wouldn't have got these 20 points for this practice because the percentages would have been 0. But you really can't zero out a lot of those. You have to, go by this minimum and maximum. Looks like you could zero out everything that you're not interested in, but still, that's going to affect your ranking. But hopefully, it gives the local work group some flexibility in determining some of those things. Again, the vulnerability percentages can be set from 10 to 40. Plan practices from 15. It looks like 15 is the set amount for that. Resource priorities, program priorities, and efficiencies. So again, doing some of those things, understanding those ranking percentages, I think will help. And if we consistently assess resource concerns, regardless of program, so regardless of whether it's an EQIP or a CSP, or if it's just a general planning, field offices should assess a certain set of resource concerns by land use. And I think if we can make sure that happens, it will improve our consistency among our rankings. Another thing is with this last year, we kind of got the cart questions late in the game. A lot of the offices had been out to the field 6 months previous. They didn't go back to the field. They're trying to answer these assessment questions from what they remember being out in the field 6 months ago. So, hopefully the planners should take these lists of questions to the field and answer those questions as they're in the field when they're doing their resource inventory as part of the planning process, not necessarily as part of the program process. So I think the more that we can get planners to answer those questions while they're out there in the field, the more consistent that will be. And of course, they should be provided those questions prior to the resource inventory. And with 2021, they have made some changes to those, and we've put those questions together. And that's also part of the bulletin that we're trying to get put out so that that can be sent out to the field. So that's kind of a little bit of the process on how you look at it. Again, assessing one resource concern, we have 112 points. 2, we have 113. 3 categories, we have 114. Soil quality, we have more. So as you keep adding these resource concerns that are being assessed, because the practices are added regardless of whether there's a concern or not, those percentages or those points are going to increase. So that's just kind of a little bit, hopefully it kind of gives you an idea of how this system works. Some people say, well, it's, I don't like the way that works and whatever. I kind of like the way it does reward people that have more vulnerabilities. If there's more problems out there, they get more points. And if they do more practices, they get more points, regardless of whether there's a resource concern or not. So, picking assessing a certain set of resource concerns, and somebody that's doing one practice is not going to get as many points as somebody that does 2, 3, or 4 practices. So you can kind of see how that works and how it was designed to match what EQIP and CSP is supposed to be paying us for. The problem is that we have to give up a little control about what we think, how we think a certain application should rank. And I think we need to avoid trying to tailor the system to make it do what we want it to do. So anyway, that's my opinion, and hopefully you can see how this, it's a little bit harder for them to tailor it to fund exactly the applications that they want. So that's kind of what I had. If anybody has any comments or questions, I'd be glad to look into that. And
Johnny, can you talk just a little bit more about how if I understand it correctly, the way that the assessment questions are answered is what indicates whether we have a vulnerability or not?
Yes. So the vulnerability is based on the threshold and the existing condition. So for example, I'm going to go back to the sheet and rill erosion. This is actually, the planner answers questions for sheet and rill erosion. They don't run Russell 2. They don't run IET. Geospatially, the cart looks at the soils that are out there and determines the threshold. And then their existing condition is based on mainly an answer to a question about how much residue is out there. So if they say, well, there's a lot of residue, they get 50 points. It's not a concern. If there's just a little residue, maybe they get 10 points. It is a concern. So, all of this is determined by CART, mainly geospatially or through answering a question. For example, under concentrated flow, ephemeral gully, there's one question. It's, are there ephemeral gullies present? Well, if there are not any, then they get 51 points. That's their existing condition. If there are gullies out there, they get 1 point. So then that's a problem. So, basically through geospatially determining thresholds, or a lot of these thresholds are just set at 50, but the questions they answer gives them certain points. A really good one to look at is that ephemeral gully erosion. It asks, are there ephemeral gullies out there? If you say, yes, there's some out there, he gets 1 point. If you say, no, there's not any out there, there's not any ephemeral gullies, he gets 51 points, and it's not a concern. So all of these are developed. This is all within the CART assessment. They don't have to run Russell 2. They don't have to do, they would answer questions, for example, if there's a bank erosion problem, are the banks stable? Well, if they are, he probably gets 50 points. If they're not, he gets less points and there is a concern. So then that automatically calculates that vulnerability based on the difference between the threshold and the existing condition or existing practices. For example, let's say we have the existing condition is 30, but if we had an existing practice, say conservation crop rotation, which gives him 10 points already out there, well, then that decreases the vulnerability because, you know, it's the score is calculated by the threshold minus the existing condition minus the existing practices. So that's, you know, our vulnerability is less because we're already doing a practice out there. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's exactly what I was wondering. So even though it gets more points, like you say, but as far as translating into a final score, the more resource concerns where you have an existing condition that shows a resource concern, the more points on the back end the application would have. But yes, it doesn't look like it changes it a lot.
The more vulnerability, and keep in mind this vulnerability is really a pretty low score in this case because my resource concern category, the wind and water erosion, is only 10%. And there's like 18 categories. If you look, you know, these are your categories. So, you know, each one of these can be a certain percentage and it has to add up to 100%. So, for example, let's say I was really interested in terrestrial habitat, so I'm going to make that maybe 35% and all these others low. So, you know, you can adjust those percentages. You know, that's where this comes in. If you look at these, this air quality emissions is based on, you know, all of these things, and I can set it to 0 up to 35. Well, in this case, it's set at 5. You know, it could have been 0. Maybe my local work group is not concerned about air quality emissions. I can set it to 0. But I am really interested in terrestrial habitat, so I'm going to move it up to 35. But when I do that, I got to decrease these so that it doesn't add up to more than 100. So these percentages here have to add up to 100%. And you've got minimums and maximums here. And the same thing on the vulnerabilities, you have these are all flexible as far as the ranking, you know, putting the percentages in there. So, you know, but, you know, some of these are kind of limited on how much you can change them. The plan practice is you can't change it at all. The efficiencies, you can't change at all. Resources, you can go from 20 to 60. Program 5 to 15. So, you know, it kind of gives you an idea of these percentages and how those add up. And here we see, you know, with this 200 points for, he answered a bunch of those questions, he got 200 points for it, but since the percentages were only set at 5, he only got 10 points for that. Whereas this case, the resource priorities were set higher, so he gets 100 out of that 200 for that. So they can adjust those things also. But basically, this assessment, they really do not have any control of whether it meets the threshold or it doesn't meet the threshold.
Hey, Johnny?
Yes.
The big question, even since last year for myself and maybe others, have been, we work with the resource, the 18 different categories, and what their focus is for that, and then we adjust to make sure that we get the right percentage in that place, tweaking to make sure we don't go past the 100. The other part, though, that's always been a little bit of a misnomer for myself is the vulnerabilities, plan practice effects, resource priorities, program priorities, not finding the right percentage there. And, you know, you talk about them being program specific. You know, how would you say an LRA in a CAFO situation versus an LRA in a crop situation? Would it not have the same vulnerability, you know, but also trying to, you know, I think that needs to have more to it in plan practice effects than probably the resource and the program priorities, but I don't know. Well, guidance would be helpful so I don't.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know exactly how the best way to, you know, if I want to give them more points for, for example, in this situation, I've got 0.2 in vulnerability because my vulnerability, the percentage is 20. Well, let's say, for instance, I increase that to 40. Well, that's going to give me twice as many points, but it's still a really low amount. And the same thing, I can also adjust these water and wind erosion resource concern category. Right now it's at 10, but I could go up to 35. So if I do 35%, then that also increases my vulnerability score because it's more vulnerable to sheet and rill erosion. And for example, let's say I'm not concerned about wind. I just want it all to be sheet and rill erosion, so I can change this to 100. Well, that increases both the vulnerability and the total practices based on, that change. So, here, our sheet and rill erosion and our wind erosion of this 35% for this category, it's 50-50, but I could set it to 0 and 100, and that changes the vulnerability and the practice scores because those numbers are calculating into that. The question is, what number should you put in there? The answer is, I don't know, but depending on what they want to do. Keep in mind that probably a local work group, their best choice or best mode to make adjustments would be here under either the categories and or the actual individual resource concern percentages. So if I'm really interested in doing terrestrial habitat wildlife, I'm going to probably increase this to 35 and decrease some of these to make up that 35 so they don't add up to more than 100.
Well, that's how I did them last year. I focused on what their need and what they kept striving to go toward, what was important to them in their local work group, and keeping in the same mindset of the ranking component weights, kind of that stayed like a constant. I may not have gone high enough up on vulnerabilities versus I would weigh out on resource priorities and program priorities. So apparently the allowable maxes have changed because I don't remember being 60 last year, but I would put more emphasis there so I could get them in their program questions, but maybe that's not exactly where we need to be pulling towards. Maybe plan practice effects and vulnerability needs to weigh a little bit more. That's kind of one of my.
And this is actually just I got this from, came from a ranking pool in the training database that was set for the general EQIP 2021 template. But I don't know that is what determines those allowable minimums and maximum is that EQIP, the national EQIP template. They set those in that national EQIP template. So, the thing to do would be to go in there and look at, the national template and see how those minimums and maximums are set. I was assuming that that's probably what's going to happen for 2021, but I can't guarantee that. So I'm not sure about these numbers. The allowable, like I said, that's all set in the national template that's sent out that you base all your EQIP rankings on. So I'm assuming that this is what the 2021 was going to be, but I'm not sure about that. It could be different. So, the 60 may or may not be accurate.
I look at that, if they're allowing you to go to 40 or 60, maybe they're putting somewhat of an emphasis saying, you could go because those are what matters kind of in the scheme of things with the 18 categories. Because last year they didn't give you that much, so maybe they've tweaked it, but they're giving you more chances to. What's more important would be things that have more of an allowable max. That probably has nothing to do with that scientific answer.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments?
Johnny, this is Brian. One comment that I would make is this has shed a lot of light to me. I've noticed resource concerns that we traditionally have not been looking for. One, my favorite example is I've been taught my whole career that we just don't have wind erosion in Arkansas. And then we kind of fought in certain counties to say, yes, we do. And now I'm seeing it pop up all over the place in almost every county. And this is kind of shedding some light as to why we may very well be seeing a lot of that.
Yeah, and I think I agree with you, Brian. I think we've never had a wind erosion problem. We don't have to run WEP or WEPs to calculate wind erosion because we don't have wind erosion problem. But there could be some wind erosion in there, and it's all calculated in CART in the background based on geospatial soils information, climate information. How much wind that has. And then they figure out how much cover is out there. They answer a question to determine the cover, and it calculates wind erosion. So, and that's one reason why we, on these required resource concerns that we put in here, we went ahead and included wind erosion in the cropland one. So go ahead and assess it. It's like, why wouldn't you? Because it calculates it automatically. All you got to do is, and you don't even have to answer any more questions for wind erosion than you do for sheet and rill erosion, because it uses the same question to determine the cover. So you're not answering any more questions. All you got to do is say, yes, I want to assess wind erosion. So why wouldn't you? It doesn't take any more time to assess it because CART does it automatically with the same question that you answer for water erosion. So why wouldn't you assess wind erosion? And, if everybody assesses wind erosion on cropland, those that have a wind erosion problem and they're doing a cover crop, it helps that. So anyway, yeah, I think a lot of those are things that we really didn't think, I didn't really think much about. But, some of these things like aggregate instability, it's based on the soil type in the field. And sometimes, it might be a problem out there that we didn't even know. So there are a lot of things and I think, assessing these resource concerns and, if I've got cropland that's not irrigated, these are the ones I'm going to assess every time for everybody, regardless if they're signed up for CSP or EQIP, or I'm just writing a conservation plan. If I assess all of those, then it'll help to make it consistent across all the applications that I have. Anything else? And if you have any other questions, if you don't want to send me an email or something, I'll try to answer those if we have anything else that we want to discuss. But hopefully this is kind of give you a little bit of a view behind the curtain, if you will, to see that, the number of resource concerns that we're assessing, the number of practices we're putting in, the acres in the field of the total. Some of those things can make a big difference in our ranking score. So, as long as everybody does these consistently, I think it will help to make our ranking more consistent. And I know in some cases, I've heard of instances where people are, well, I didn't think this one ought to rank that high, and it's because I assessed too many resource concerns, so I'm just going to go back and pick a couple of them. Well, if you do that for one, and then everybody else gets all of them assessed for all the resource concerns, that's kind of a prejudice of how you want things to come out. And I don't think that's something we need to be doing. Well, I thank y'all for your time. Hopefully you got something out of this. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.